In the summer of 1942, the war no longer felt like a campaign with fronts and maps. It felt like a tightening ring. Claus von Stauffenberg sensed it everywhere, at briefings where optimism was performed rather than believed, in the silences between officers who once spoke freely, and in the letters from home that tried too hard to sound calm. He had been raised in a world of form and tradition, of poetry and Catholic ritual, of service to a state that was supposed to be something higher than brute power. What he saw now was power devouring its own foundations. Stauffenberg was not born a conspirator. He had sworn an oath, as had they all. In the early years he believed, as many did, that order would restore dignity after chaos. But Poland had changed him. The Eastern Front completed the transformation. He saw villages erased not by necessity but by policy, civilians treated as obstacles, and officers forced to choose between conscience and obedience. Each compromise felt small until it didn't. By 1942, dissent in Germany was a dangerous luxury. To oppose openly was to vanish. To oppose quietly was to live in constant calculation. The resistance that existed was fragmented: conservatives who despised Hitler's vulgarity, officers who feared military ruin, churchmen appalled by crimes, social democrats and communists already broken by years of terror. They shared no single vision of Germany's future, only the conviction that its present course was catastrophic. Stauffenberg's entry into this shadow world came through conversations that did not announce themselves as treason. They began as questions: is this war winnable? Is this leadership sane? What does duty mean when the state commits murder? Men like Henning von Treschow had already answered. Treschow believed that Germany's honor could only be salvaged by removing Hitler, even if the attempt failed. The assassination must be attempted, he had said, not because it would succeed, but because it would prove that not all Germans were accomplices. When Stauffenberg was grievously wounded in North Africa in 1943, losing an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of the left, the war nearly ended for him. Instead, it sharpened his resolve. The injuries forced him into staff positions closer to power. They also forced him inward. Pain, prayer, and long nights of thought converged into a single conclusion: obedience without morality was not virtue. It was cowardice dressed as discipline. Berlin in early 1944 was a city of contrasts: bombed streets and glittering receptions, ration cards and grand rhetoric. Within the Army High Command, the resistance took the form of a network that relied less on trust than on necessity. Each man knew only enough to do his part. Names were spoken cautiously. Intentions were inferred rather than declared. General Friedrich Albrecht, head of the General Army Office, had been working on contingency plans long before Stauffenberg arrived. Officially, these plans were meant to suppress internal unrest, slave labor revolts, chaos after air raids. Unofficially, they offered a legalistic framework to seize control of the state after Hitler's death. The plan's code name was Valkyrie, borrowed from a reserve army mobilization order that could be activated from Berlin. Valkyrie was not a coup in the romantic sense. It was paperwork weaponized: orders, signatures, telephone calls, and the authority of stamps. Its brilliance lay in its banality. If Hitler were dead, the regime's legitimacy would shatter. If the reserve army could be convinced, or compelled, that the SS had attempted a coup, then loyal officers might move against the party in the name of restoring order. Stauffenberg listened more than he spoke at first. He was younger than many in the circle, more intense, and possessed of a clarity that unsettled even seasoned conspirators. He believed that half measures would doom them. Others agreed in principle but hesitated in practice. The obstacle was always the same: access. Hitler was heavily guarded, unpredictable in his movements, and increasingly isolated. Attempts had been made, bombs placed on planes, briefcases swapped at the last moment, but fate, or incompetence, had intervened. What Stauffenberg brought was proximity. In July 1944, he became Chief of Staff to General Albrecht, a position that allowed him to attend Führer conferences. It was an extraordinary opportunity, and everyone knew it. With it came extraordinary risk. The conspirators debated endlessly. Who should carry the bomb? Who should activate Valkyrie? Who should speak on the radio afterward? Each decision intersected with others, a fragile geometry of timing. Stauffenberg argued that the assassin and the man who set Valkyrie in motion had to be the same. Delay would be fatal. Confusion would be exploited by the SS. "We cannot outsource courage," he said. It was not bravado. It was calculation. He understood the psychology of systems. They collapse at points of transition. The moment after the explosion would be the only moment when orders could outrun doubts. The circle grew quieter as the implications settled. Stauffenberg did not present himself as a martyr. He presented himself as a servant of necessity. Others would follow because he had made the problem smaller: one man, one act, one window. Planning an assassination in the Third Reich was less about mechanics than about choreography. The physical act mattered, but so did the story that would follow it. If Hitler died and nothing else happened, the SS would retaliate with terrifying speed. If Hitler died and the state moved instantly to claim continuity, there was a chance, slim, but real, that chaos could be contained. Valkyrie had to be rewritten. The original orders were legal, but they presumed loyalty to Hitler. Albrecht and his allies adjusted language, subtly at first, then more boldly. The revised orders framed the SS as traitors who had attempted to seize power. Reserve army units would be mobilized to secure ministries, radio stations, and communication hubs. Until order was restored. Every word mattered. Ambiguity was a tool. The goal was to move men who would obey orders without stopping to interrogate their premise. Germany's bureaucracy, which had facilitated so much evil, might now be turned against it. The plan's success hinged on speed and belief. Speed would come from rehearsed procedures, belief would come from authority. That meant signatures from respected generals and the use of official channels. It meant having officers in place at the Bendler Block, the Army's administrative headquarters, ready to issue commands the moment news arrived. Stauffenberg's role crystallized. He would attend a briefing with Hitler, carry the bomb in a briefcase, and place it as close as possible. Immediately afterward, he would leave under a pretext, return to Berlin, and initiate Valkyrie. He practiced with one hand, learning to manipulate objects with a precision born of stubbornness. He practiced the cover stories too, the excuse for leaving the room, the manner of departure, the tone he would use on the telephone. The bomb itself was a British-made explosive, powerful but compact. There was discussion about using 2 charges. Stauffenberg insisted on carrying as much as he could manage, but his injuries imposed limits. Every compromise was weighed against the ticking clock of Allied advances and internal decay. There were moral debates as well. Would killing Hitler end the war? Almost certainly not immediately. Would it save lives? Perhaps. Would it redeem Germany? That was too large a question. Stauffenberg framed it differently. It would give Germany a chance to speak again in a human voice. As July approached, the tension intensified. Hitler's schedule was erratic. Meetings were cancelled or moved at the last minute. Each abortive attempt frayed nerves. The conspirators lived in a state of suspended breath, knowing that discovery meant death not only for them but for their families. Stauffenberg wrote to his wife in careful language, expressing love without explanation. Faith, he believed, did not promise success, only meaning. July 20, 1944, dawned with deceptive calm. Stauffenberg rose early, dressed meticulously, and attended Massachusetts. The ritual steadied him. There would be no improvisation now. He traveled to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, carrying the briefcase that had become the axis of his life. The briefing was moved from its usual underground bunker to a wooden conference hut because of the heat. This small change would later assume enormous significance. Stauffenberg entered the room, greeted familiar faces, and took his place near Hitler. His heart rate slowed, training and resolve took over. With the pretext of needing to adjust his uniform, he excused himself briefly to arm the device in a nearby room. One charge was activated, the second, in a cruel twist of time and limitation, was not. Back in the conference room, he placed the briefcase as close to Hitler as circumstances allowed, near the heavy oak table. The men leaned over maps. Decisions were made that sent divisions to their deaths. Stauffenberg asked to be excused to make a telephone call. He left the room and did not look back. Minutes later, the explosion tore through the hut. The blast shattered windows and threw bodies to the floor. Stauffenberg, already in a car, saw smoke rising and allowed himself a single, dangerous assumption: it is done. He flew back to Berlin, rehearsing the next acts. On arrival at the Bendler block, he began issuing orders. Valkyrie was activated. Telephone lines hummed. Officers hesitated, then moved. In some cities, reserve army units arrested SS personnel. In others, confusion reigned. The regime's machinery, so efficient at repression, proved clumsy in uncertainty. But the assumption unraveled quickly. Reports filtered in: Hitler was alive. Injured, shaken, but alive? Joseph Goebbels seized the radio. Loyalists recovered their nerve. The ambiguity that Valkyrie relied upon dissolved into clarity. The SS moved with purpose. In the Bendler block, hope flickered and died. Arguments broke out. Some refused to believe the news. Others panicked. Stauffenberg insisted they press on. Hitler would die, he said, or be incapacitated. It was not delusion so much as refusal to surrender the only path left. By nightfall, the building was surrounded. Shots echoed in the courtyard. Orders were reversed. The men who had spoken so carefully now spoke too loudly or not at all. The collapse was swift and merciless. General Frum, seeking to save himself, convened a summary court-martial. It was a grotesque parody of justice, but appearances mattered. If the regime could claim that traitors had been punished by the army itself, the stain might be contained. Stauffenberg stood straight despite exhaustion and pain. He did not beg. He did not curse. When the sentence was pronounced, he made the sign of the cross. In the courtyard, under the harsh glare of headlights, the firing squad assembled. The night air carried the smell of summer and smoke. His last words, according to witnesses, were for a sacred Germany. Whether he meant a Germany purified by suffering or one redeemed by resistance is a question that historians still debate. The shots rang out. The body fell. The plot was over. But the reckoning had only begun. Over the following weeks, the Gestapo dismantled the resistance with chilling efficiency. Trials before the People's Court were staged as spectacles of humiliation. Families were arrested under the principle of Sippenhaft, kin liability. The regime demanded not just obedience but annihilation of memory. From a purely operational standpoint, the plot failed because of contingencies: the moved meeting, the single charge, the sturdy table leg that deflected the blast. From a political standpoint, it failed because it depended on a level of institutional loyalty that no longer existed. The army was compromised, divided, and fearful. The SS was ruthless and alert. Yet to measure the plot only by its failure is to misunderstand its purpose. Treschow had been clear: the attempt itself mattered. In a state that had criminalized dissent, the act of saying no at the highest level was a form of testimony. Stauffenberg's plan was shaped by constraints that few outside the circle appreciated. He did not command armies, he commanded moments. He relied on the very structures he despised because they were the only ones available. Valkyrie was a mirror held up to the regime, a demonstration that legality without justice is a hollow shell. There is a temptation to romanticize the conspirators, to cast them as unblemished heroes. History resists such simplicity. Some had supported the regime early on. Some were motivated by patriotism more than human rights. Some hoped to negotiate a better peace rather than confront the full horror of what had been done. But at a time when conformity was safer than conscience, they chose risk. In the final months of the war, the regime invoked July 20th as proof of internal enemies. Propaganda vilified the conspirators as aristocratic traitors. Yet the very intensity of the response betrayed anxiety. The idea that resistance existed, within the officer corps, within tradition, could not be entirely erased. After the war, Germany struggled with memory. For years, the July 20th plot was viewed ambivalently. Some saw treason, others saw belated courage. Over time, the narrative shifted. Memorials were erected. Names once whispered were spoken aloud. Stauffenberg's portrait, with its eye patch and uncompromising gaze, became an emblem of moral resistance. Historians continue to debate the plot's feasibility. Could it ever have succeeded? Perhaps under slightly different circumstances. But counterfactuals have limits. What remains is the plan as it was conceived, a fusion of desperation and discipline, faith and bureaucracy, violence and restraint. Chapter 8: What Remains. To tell this story is to confront uncomfortable truths. Resistance does not guarantee success. Conscience does not confer immunity. Plans built from compromised materials will bear those compromises. And yet, the absence of resistance carries its own verdict. Stauffenberg's plan was developed in the narrow corridors of a dying state, under the pressure of time and terror. It was not perfect. It was not pure. It was, however, an assertion that individuals within a system can still choose. On July 20, 1944, that choice detonated, not just in a conference room in East Prussia, but in the historical record. The blast did not kill a dictator. It shattered the lie that everyone had agreed. And in that shattering, however brief, something like truth was heard.